by way of opening and orientation, when I speak to a practice audience, particularly interested in, again, the family-based context that impact on children's development, mental health, welfare, well-being, education, protection, etc. What I'm 2/3 of what I'm about to present to you, I almost sort of apologize for, because I'm about to present an array of evidence suggesting that the rearing experiences children have map onto their development, welfare, and well-being, which would be not a great deal of surprise to those in the room. However, Sally, not Sarah, right? Sally, thank you, used the phrase evidence-led and knowledge-based practice, and it's people like myself that generate the evidence-led and hopefully knowledge-based practice. And let me give you sort of a tutorial 101. We had Maslow's hierarchy of needs a second ago. Let me give you the kind of evidence-based tutorial 101. For researchers, particularly quantitative-based researchers, our challenge is to phrase a question, such as the rearing experiences children are exposed to, or high levels of interparental discord, conflict, violence, lead to poor outcomes for children, and we test the opposite. We have what's called a null hypothesis. We have to test the opposite of that with the objective of refuting it, so as to conclude it appears that harsh rejecting parenting, for example, map onto poor outcomes for children. Again, from a practice standpoint, you'll say, goodness me, people are spending money on doing this? Yes, they are. And I hope by the end of the presentation that money will be usefully spent in terms of mapping onto your practice interests, because if someone throws a confounding challenge to you, we'll say, what about the following? How do we know that rearing experiences map onto children's outcomes? Well, I see it in practice. I'm going to offer several challenges to that statement, which as a researcher, about 15 years or so ago, I was silenced. And again, I'm not easily silenced. And took me 15 years to come back with an answer in terms of evidence. And it's that story I'll try and tell you today. So if I say things from a researcher standpoint that you think, oh my goodness me, I can't believe people are asking these questions, we're asking the questions to test them and hopefully offer evidence that map onto what you actually do see or answer practice. Is that okay? So I'll give you my little apology right from the outset. So what my researcher's apology. So what I'm going to do is give you an introduction to really the field of child development, and assume that nobody knows anything about normal child development. Give you a very brief overview of normal child development, specifically then focusing on the interparental and the parent-child relationships as two indicators, two measures of rearing environment. There are, of course, lots of other aspects of rearing environment, particularly school environment, peer environment, wider community environment, wider family environment, cultural environments, etc., and we can carry on. So when I use the phrase environment, it really is a multidimensional construct. I'm going to focus on two particular domains, interparental and parent-child relationships. I'll then present and show you what I do for a day job, kind of pays the salary, which is actually the research that we conduct, and give you two studies that take on two fundamental questions linked to interparental relationship influences on children. And then last but not least, the section of the presentation that, say, 2 years ago even, I would have said, well, there are policy and practice implications of this research, which I've been saying for about 20 years. And not just myself, others. Again, when I talk about research, I'm a spokesperson for the researchers in this field. I do some of the research, not all of it. But where we have policy and practice messages over the past 2 years in particular, the traction in the UK, particularly in England, has been really quite explosive. And hopefully that will translate into bottom line practice opportunities for you. So again, at the end of the presentation. So where do I start? Well, I start, again, I'm going to take the full hour on this because I want to not feel rushed. Is that okay? It's a long trip up to Hartlepool, so I'm going to take the time to give you the message, and the long trip back down again, I'll say that was worth it. Okay, I'll start with a picture of a young boy. It can be a young girl, it can be an older boy, it can be an older girl. And I'm going to ask a question that I ask when I give a lecture to undergraduate students, first-year undergraduate students. I come into the lecture series kind of late in the syllabus, and I'm a developmental psychologist. So I'm trained as a developmental psychologist. I was trained in the United States. I'm what's called a developmental psychopathologist. We're interested in understanding how the development of poor well-being, psychopathology, might be explained, and importantly, what we might do to improve trajectories around poor mental health outcomes. And Sally, and to commend Sally, I rarely hear, if ever, in terms of Children's Services spokesperson, use the phrase intergenerational transmission. Thank you. That's what we do. We fundamentally are directed, developmental psychopathologists, not everybody from Ireland, developmental psychopathologists, look to understand processes that affect development that then transfer across generations. Early intervention really is at the start of a process across generations, not just fixing a problem between the ages of 9 and 11, or 5 and 7, or indeed the first 1,000 years of life, but actually across generations. So this young man, when I walk into lecture theatre, I have a silent kind of build-up. I say, hands up. Does this young man, this young boy, look happy? And some undergraduate students nod, and some look a bit perplexed, and others look, what is the answer from my face? And I pause and go, well, does he really look happy? Oh, no, he doesn't look happy. Does he look unhappy? Does he look more unhappy than happy? Does he look a little bit frustrated? Does he look annoyed? Does he look agitated? See, a bit more the agitated domain, right? And we carry on, and I give some further information. I said, I can't really go into the details. And you gradually work your way down to the child looks a little bit psychopathic. And everyone's kind of nodding away, and, oh yeah, I love psychology. This is why I came to do it. This absolutely looks a bit psychopathic, conduct disorder, etc., etc. And I say, well, the first thing in terms of, and this is a serious point, in terms of clinical practice, normal child development, is to understand that development has normative or typical signposts, okay? What is normal? If a person walks in and says, I didn't sleep very well, how did you sleep last night? I didn't sleep very well. I was really worried about the large monster underneath my bed. And that's an 18-year-old colleague or friend. You might say, that's slightly concerning. And you might ask some questions about what he or she was doing the previous night, for instance. I might explain that. Or if the child is 3.5, 4, that's a different conversation. Or the child says, I'm speaking to my friend out in the back garden, the child's wandering around. And both my children do this, wandering around, sort of speaking out loud to nobody. So the question is, what is normal and what is atypical? If we're going to understand development of psychopathology, we have to understand not what is just a behavior, but how does that behavior deviate from typical development? Okay? So really, really important point in terms of understanding mental health. The phrase mental health, which is used regularly, particularly over the past 12 months, media, etc. Mental health refers to doing well. Mental health. Poor mental health refers to not doing so well, or mental ill health refers to not doing so well. But actually, understanding mental health allows us to understand pathways into poor mental health or mental ill health. So you can't have the latter without the former. So, in terms of explaining normal development, or indeed abnormal development, two basic worlds, three worlds you'll see in a second that researchers focus on. First of all, genetics, and I'll talk quite a bit about genetics through the presentation. I'll make it as straightforward and simple as I possibly can, but I'll refer to genetics in a way that isn't typically referred to when we address development. Nature, historically. Nurture. Nurture, again, historically, people would say parenting, socialization processes. Nurture is also prenatal exposures. Nurture is the prenatal rearing environment. Postnatal rearing environment, when I won't go into in detail today, peer influences. Peer influence, a huge impact, huge influence on children's development. Family rearing environment influences. Parenting. This is the best picture not the best, a picture of parenting. I have a 16-year-old, and this works in terms of the WhatsApp and emojis, the rolling eyes. That's all I do now to my 16-year-old in every possible, and I'm being recorded, and you might even watch this, is rolly eyes in terms of what he says to me and I say to him, and we get on very well, I hope. Interparental relationship. You can break apart, of course, the pictures presented of two adults and child, couple and child into single parent configurations and an array of other partnership configurations which we'll come into as I progress. But in terms of environment, prenatal, social peer environment, parenting environment, interparental environment, I will focus on the parenting interparental specifically in terms of looking at outcomes for children. A more recent area of research, very promising area of research, is what's called epigenetics. Anybody heard of that term? Very important. Epigenetics essentially is you take the world of genetics. I'll go through some background that as I progress the presentation. But one hypothesis is everything about our behavior, your behavior is informed by genetic attributes, genetically transferred attributes. I will refute that, but it's a hypothesis. Another is that rearing environments alone explain everything about what's called individual differences in personality development. We can also refute that. A third perspective is that actually biological factors, genetic factors, and rearing experiences work together. It's nature versus nurture, nature via nurture. More recently, epigenetics is an area of science showing that where an individual or an animal species has exposure to a particular form of environment, stress, for example, that environment can activate what's called DNA methylation. A gene system or genetic susceptibility factor fires under specific conditions. And a study using animal studies, Michael Meaney, showed that the frequency of licking cross-fostered rat pups showed when a particular, what's called a serotonergic system, fired. That's hugely important. That's Bowlby's attachment theory. Touching, stroking, licking, affection. Showing that the social environment is activating biological systems. Epigenetics. Hugely important. Okay? Very promising. Very promising in that the studies use involve cross-fostered rat pups. Without being too trite in this, what does that translate to? Children taken out of harsh, negative rearing environments, placed in enriched rearing environments, who do better. Not only do better necessarily for themselves, but those environments might be activating gene system responses that then transfer to the next generation. Adoption, foster care, step parent, raised from institutional context into rearing environments, etc. Hugely important research for the area of human development, in particular in the area of children's services and the like. To make things more complex and complicated, these factors don't work in isolation. They all work together. Okay? And bottom line, they influence what? Child's ability to understand and respond to his or her social world. And that's what we're interested in understanding. That's what we're interested in influencing for the positive in terms of support, service, and intervention. If it helps, this young man here is now my 16-year-old son. There's the rolly eyes over there. Who was, we were visiting New Zealand, and he had probably spent at least 2 hours waiting for that ice cream cone. Because I kept stopping, looking at things and talking to people, and there was a queue for the ice cream van. And we got to the top of the ice cream van, and I had no money. And I couldn't pay for it. I had to go back to the back of the queue and wait again. And when he got the ice cream, I said, "Can you just pause there? I want you to take a photograph." So he was a little bit worn out waiting for the ice cream. So quite normal. He's just a little bit frustrated, to use the polite phrase, okay? Normal development, okay? So understanding the context, the influences, the explanations that might sit behind a behavior we see or we're trying to intervene with respect to identifies what we do to try to treat that particular outcome. And in terms of treatment or intervention, I'm not necessarily saying, there, it'll be fine, you have your ice cream now, don't be upset. A focus on the problem. I might actually be focusing on the causes of the problem in order to remediate what I'm seeing. And that's what we're going to focus on in terms of research here. Okay, couple relationship. So just again by way of scene setting. So I'm going to focus very specifically on the couple relationship. There's a research report I'll put up at the end of this presentation. There's several publications very recently that have just come out. One just yesterday accepted. I'm quite happy to talk to people about that at the end of this talk, which directly maps on to your practice interests here. That scene sets, very important in terms of government policy presently. One of the arguments I've made repeatedly in terms of the interparental relationship is that you must absolutely separate out research focusing on the interparental relationship and intervention programs targeting the interparental relationship versus just the couple relationship. It's a lot of research, a lot of intervention, years focusing on the couple relationship, targeting aspects of couple relationship satisfaction that are not necessarily targeting aspects of that relationship that map onto child outcomes. So a review I conducted with the Early Intervention Foundation actually whittled down a number of eligible programs quite promptly in where these programs designed to map onto measurable outcomes for children specific to the interparental relationship versus a focus on couple dynamics. Okay, so from a practice standpoint and an intervention standpoint and program choice, that's a significantly important point in terms of going forward. So, a lot of history around the couple relationship, et cetera, et cetera. I'm interested in this particular dynamic, the interparental relationship, the inter-adult relationship, the inter-carer relationship. And they're terms I can use quite freely and fluently now. I couldn't have used, again, several years ago without the benefit of research evidence. So historically, we might say that the interparental relationship only maps onto outcomes for children within the context of married versus not married family types, divorce, intact versus non-intact families. when I use the term relationship, I'm now talking empirically and operationally about this dynamic, not the status of this relationship. Okay? Again, might sound obvious. Quite a radical departure in terms of government policy to refer to an adult's relationship functioning as a factor for child outcome versus their marital status in terms of policy investment. This picture captures about several hundred years of research and proposal around child development. Pro forma, tabula rasa, Immanuel Kant, Rousseau, several hundred years. The child is born as a blank slate or with form, nature versus nurture. Environment, historically environment and children is this relationship, is the mother-child relationship. Very little focus on the father-child relationship, next to limited focus on the interparental relationship, other than domestic abuse, domestic violence, divorce, separation. Yeah? So again, I'm going to go into territory that will be fairly practice obvious to you, but in terms of research, talking about the dynamic between these two adults, whether they're living together or not, whether they're genetically related or not, is very new. Specifically, as that relationship maps onto parenting processes and practices, not just maternal parenting, but paternal parenting and co-parenting practices with respect to child outcome and this child becoming this adult and the replication of processes over time. That's the operational theoretical framework that we now operate in, which I'm pleased and thankfully early enough in my career to hopefully continue to promote. And that is the policy and practice framework that advisors are now recognizing in terms of investment and program support, etc. So it's a very, very good time to be in this space, in my view, notwithstanding all the practical challenges and cuts, etc. Okay, so I'm going to kind of stop there, if you like, in terms of telling the story that I hope you can see what we have in common as a researcher in this area and a practitioner workforce in this area. And if you can imagine me putting on the kind of scientist's outfit, whatever that looks like, for the next 2/3 of the presentation, I will speak as a researcher, as a scientist. Where I was asked a question 2 or so years ago, which led to work with the Early Intervention Foundation and the Department of Work and Pensions. Can you present evidence that the interparental relationship maps on to measurable outcomes for children relative to parenting, and a really important challenge, which I won't tell you just yet. But in terms of making that case, can you present evidence? So that's what I'm going to try to do for the next 40 or so minutes, okay? And I'll give you the question en route, the killer question. Okay, so review of evidence. First, where do you start with evidence on family relationship or family socialization influences on children? Well, again, Researcher 101, you start with the dependent variables. Emotional welfare and well-being, psychological welfare and well-being, development. 2 reports, 1998, 2008, more recent report. The report in 2008 by the World Health Organization in part with UNICEF concluded that children living in the United Kingdom were doing least well among similar-age children in the OECD, economically well-off countries, in 3 areas of welfare and well-being. Subjective welfare and well-being, how they perceived their own quality of life. Their perceptions of family support, family connectedness, and their risks for engaging in risky health-related behaviors, smoking, drinking, substance misuse, etc. Least well-off among OECD countries. And multiple other reports echo that. And there's variation across the United Kingdom by region in terms of indices of welfare and well-being. What areas do we see in terms of welfare and well-being? So a report by myself and others back in 2000 made the case where historically a focus has been on what we call clinical phenotype. In other words, an index of poor mental health, depression, anxiety, conduct problems, is not necessarily an index of poor mental health unless that index attains levels of clinical significance. You get that? Unless it's ICD-10 or DSM-5 as it now is, diagnosable, it isn't technically a problem. It's not precisely what any mental health professional would say, but in terms of a diagnostic standpoint. We know from evidence that actually individuals can experience serious challenges in their life, serious difficulties in their life, and also pose risk to others, where problems are what we call sub-threshold. So children can have extremely difficult, challenging lives and not necessarily attain levels of clinical significance yet. Internalizing problems: anxiety, depression, dysphoria, withdrawal, sadness. Externalizing problems: aggression, conduct disorder, antisocial behavior, criminality, etc. Social competence: being able to relate well to other people, peers, siblings, family members, etc. Academic attainment: doing well in school, behaving well in school. Physical health: substance misuse, engage in behaviors that challenge physical health and welfare and well-being. And more extreme outcomes: homelessness, suicidality, criminality. Importantly, these problems, we now recognize, tend not to occur in nice, neat, isolated packages. You don't see just an anxious child or a depressed child or a child with conduct problems. Anxious behavior may lead to depressive symptoms, may lead to conduct problems, may lead to poor social competence, reduced academic attainment, increased risk for poor physical health, and more severe outcomes, including suicidality. So we refer to what are called cascades of developmental psychopathology, cascades of problems. So previously what we saw is just outcome variables, mental health, etc., may actually be part of causal processes. Do you get that? So picking up symptoms early, such as anxiety, for instance, may be a first step to preventing suicidality, antisociality. Costs speak for themselves. Again, these estimates are taken from estimates of clinical disorder. If we were to go into the realm of subthreshold, our costs would go up exponentially. Causes, or at least correlates. The two reports I mentioned, 98 Mental Health Foundation and the OECD report, refer to family support as a factor in relative to outcomes. What do we mean by family factors? I'll come back to genetics in a second, the big one. If you go back into the research evidence from pretty much 1980s plus, earlier, but 1980s plus, the standout factors that serve as correlates to any one or more of these outcomes: economic pressure, poverty, well known. Economic deprivation, economic disadvantage, poverty, etc. More recently, we refer to work stress. Simply trying to make ends meet because the work demands, income levels, etc. Work demands are going up, income is going down. So work stress, not necessarily poverty, worklessness, economic disadvantage, just economic pressure is increasingly associated with outcomes for children. Parent mental health: depression, antisociality serve as risk factors for children's mental health. Parenting behavior, classically attachment theories, etc. Parenting style, which I'll refer to. Parenting style, most people won't need me to explain that. Parenting style as compared to the attachment realm. Three main parenting styles that most parenting programs target: authoritarian parenting, do as I say and don't ask why. Do as I tell you and don't ask why. Authoritative parenting, do as I ask and here's why. Permissive parenting, do what you want and I don't really mind if you ask me why. With the authoritarian and the permissive not necessarily being associated with positive outcomes for children. Interparental conflict, domestic violence. Historically, researchers have focused on domestic abuse, domestic violence, neglect, etc. Interparental conflict has again historically been denoted as overt, physical, harsh, observable behaviors. As you'll see through the presentation and the various reports I mentioned, myself and colleagues have framed the risk dimensions, if you like, of interparental conflict as lying across a silence to violence continuum. That children who experience relationship attributes between adults where there's a distinct lack of warmth, but not violence, or discord per se, right the way up to the violence domain, are at elevated risk. And that's intact or non-intact households. And parental separation and divorce. Still a big signal in terms of outcomes for children. It's now recognized, however, levels of conflict that exist before, during, and after separation may tell us more about children's long-term adaptation to divorce than the event itself. Divorce is still a very stressful event, but the recovery of it, the adaptation, I should say, to divorce appears to be explained by conflict levels. Also, we know that in in single-parent households, or these step-parent households, the psychological welfare, well-being, and ability to relate well to other people, parents and children in a single-parent household, and indeed step-parent households, map on to improved outcomes for children. So it appears less about the status per se of the relationship and more about the relationship quality. Individual and intact households, that explains outcomes for children. Likewise, these outcomes do not occur, I beg your pardon, these early causes do not occur in isolation. As you'll see in a second, researchers, just as we talk about cascading models here, I'm spending quite a bit of time on this because the research you're about to see builds on this logic. From a practice standpoint, this is particularly important. perhaps easy for me as a researcher to say, well, we've got these complicated cascade models and complicated cascade models here. But what does it mean for you at the practice level? I could put an array of pathways and points along a so-called journey, and then you might say, well, where do we intervene? Where do we target practice resource? Hopefully these figures will help you recognize where and when and how, but it's very important to recognize that in the context that we're working in, these factors occur collectively, operationally. So, to start, if you go back here, you can just kind of, I don't know if you have my slides. You're welcome to have my slides post-presentation, by the way. But if you just go from here to here to here to here, and back up to here, this figure is particularly important. In the context of economic disadvantage, this particular theoretical model you're about to see has become even more timely. So, this is work led by my former PhD supervisor, Rand Conger, from a project in the Midwest United States in the late 1980s. Early 1980s, the Iowa State Legislature, the kind of state powers, recognized that based on a prospective policy change, specifically where farming support and subsidy was going to be directed, may lead to economic collapse for an array of households. And based on work emanating from the 1930s by a guy called Glenn Elder, who wrote a book called Children of the Great Depression. If you want to read genuinely a worthwhile academic text that is accessible beyond just the academia, it's Children of the Great Depression by Glenn Elder. If you want to understand intergenerational transmission, read the book. This book tells the story of children who were born to parents in the 1930s who experienced the Great Depression and their life stories. And the links to mortality and the really quite surprising areas of mortality that these children experience really is quite eye-opening. The logic is early risk, early exposure, economic stress sets the stage for a cascade of processes that put individuals, children in those contexts, at risk. If you think of economic disadvantage today, and the point Sally made earlier, this is exactly the framework we should be working from if we are trying to improve outcomes for children who experience economic disadvantage, as just one indicator of family stress. So, working with a sample of just over 500 Midwestern farm families, Iowa-based families, with an adolescent child and a sibling within 2 years of that age, this group followed these families for now nearly 20 years, and showed that should be 2017 in terms of recent research, showed that over 5 to 7 years of this study, that where economic pressure is measured as stress, I can pay the bills, but I'm stressed. I'm not sure what's around the corner, I'm stressed. Through to poverty, through to job loss, etc. That there are poor outcomes, long-term, longitudinal outcomes for children. The outcomes I've worked in, and colleagues in this area, just to put up, early sleep problems, one of the most significant predictors of typical or normal typical child development is sleep. Sleep directly linked to brain development, nutrition, sleep. That's why children sleep a lot, feed a lot, cry a lot. Brain development. Conduct problems. Poor academic attainment. Again, not independent of each other. The area I've worked most directly in is depression, child and adolescent depression. Female depression, male depression, and the intergenerational transmission of depression. These figures are put up representing about 30 years of research where the model you're about to see maps onto explaining, when I say outcome, each of these domains and more. So, economic pressure, child problems. These researchers say, yes, anywhere you see a red line, by the way, I'm taking away all the kind of complicated statistics. A red line simply means I'm refuting the hypothesis that economic pressure does not map on to child problems. Okay? 500 families, children, etc. What these researchers show is that in the context of economic stress, economic disadvantage, associations with child problems are not direct. In other words, literally throwing money here. If you don't correct here, if you throw money here and you correct here, great. But if you don't correct here, and this remains a problem, that actually outcomes to children are not direct, they're indirect. Economic stress leads to elevated maternal and paternal depression. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, any research within a family context that had this variable in play was novel. Might be obvious now. Wasn't obvious then. So, economic pressure, poor mental health. Depression specifically, I should say. Elevated parent-child problems. So, economic pressure leads to elevated paternal and maternal depression, which leads to more negative parenting practices, specifically more authoritarian-based, permissive-based, and less authoritative-based parenting, which is then associated with children's conduct problems. Do you see that? So several years, we arrive at what's called a family stress model. This is the Conger, Jerry Patterson, Glenn Elder, family socialization theorists. I was trained in the area of family socialization. I had the great privilege to work with Glenn Elder and Jerry Patterson and Rand Conger in a group where if you used the term genes, and I'm being recorded, so I'm quite happy to go on record to say this, if you used the word genes in my research group back then, and you weren't talking about denim, you had to go off and stand in a corner. And there was another group in Pennsylvania that did all the genetic stuff, Robert Plowman and David Rees, Sandra Scarr and people, David Rowe, I should say. So this is a classic family socialization perspective. I was either in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the right time. Either way, it was the right place at the right time for me. But researchers in the group began to say, well, okay, so on that basis, based on these processes, I said earlier, where would you target your intervention? What's the kind of most proximal link to child outcomes? Well, based on this model, you would probably target it here. If you can't effectively target here, or effectively target here, but you can effectively target here in terms of child outcome, you would put your money there. Do you see that? And that's where the vast majority of investment has gone for the past several decades. And parenting is a substantively important influence on children's development. Probably for the first time in the context, you can never say first time in research, one of the early studies to show this particular association in this group, these are intact households, not divorced or separating, etc. Looked at a paper by two researchers, John Grich and Frank Fincham in 1990, put a proposal out that actually the attributions children assign to their parents' arguments may tell us more about their adaptation than the arguments themselves. Very novel proposal. How a child understands what's happening around them may tell us more about their adaptation than what's happening around them. That doesn't say that domestic violence is not a real and significant influence, or conflict across the spectrum, but the perceptions children assign, it moves the research away from the child as object to the child as subject. And I was asked to read this paper back in 1990. I was an early postgraduate student in the US. It's about interparental conflict, child development, child mental health. I come from Dublin. And someone is saying to me, do you want to read about family dynamics and maybe write a PhD on it, and we'll pay you to do it? No problem. And then you get into the, and you can, because, that would sound fairly obvious to me. And then you start reading the research. And the research isn't, let me tell you how obvious that statement is. Let me tell you about all the challenges to that statement that we need to find answers to. And that's what research is about. But this group began to explore this question and found that economic stress, this is a rolling movie now, not just snapshot. Economic stress leads to elevated maternal and paternal depression, leads to increased interparental discord. What do I mean by interparental discord? Discord between couples is normal. When handled well, children do well. I saw a piece of proposed intervention implementation saying we're going to have a pledge to eradicate interparental conflict. That would be completely wrong. Discord, quarreling, disagreeing, not having the same view is normal. Learning how to manage that with respect to productive resolution type skills and processes is positive, particularly when it comes to child outcomes. So conflict that is frequent, intense, poorly resolved, and child-related puts children at elevated risk. That form of conflict leads to poorer parenting practices, leads to negative outcomes for children. And that's sort of where the story stopped around 1991, 1992. And an academic paper in 1992 came out saying, all this research, Paul Amato, who's done a lot of research in divorce, Gordon Harold, John Grich, Frank Fincham, Mark Cummings, lots of other eminent, not that I'm eminent, much more eminent researchers than me in that area, making the case that interparental discord in intact households seems to impact children via parenting. And they're actually saying, do you know something? If you just focus on parenting support in the context of interparental discord, you might be missing out on a key influence for children's outcomes. A paper came out in 1992 saying that any research looking at interparental relationship and child outcome via parenting, the effects will always be through parenting. Therefore, at the site of parenting, we should focus intervention, and there should be no more research in the area. That's not great when you're a young PhD student. Do you get that? There's the proximal link according to this model to child outcome. If it was the case that discord, frequent, intense, poorly resolved, child-related, affected children only ever through parenting, a child wouldn't need to be aware or witness the conflict to be affected by it. Do you get that? A child could be present, a child could be absent. They're going to be influenced in terms of outcome via parenting. Evidence doesn't support that. Where a child witnesses, can predict, is involved in discord between adults, couples, versus being absent from that, we see a direct effect on outcome, even when we support parenting. So where the child experiences conflict between adults or can predict the likely occurrence of conflict between adults, in a domestic abuse context, you won't need me to tell you, children can pick up signals well in advance of an episode of actual overt conflict, discord, or violence. So actually the Gritchen-Fincham proposal, the attributions children assign, even when parenting practices are supported, appears to explain more about their variance. And there's 20 years of research supporting that pathway. This is the key pathway. Interparental conflict does lead to more negative parenting, which in turn leads to poor outcomes for children. But if you're just treating this particular pathway, this particular step en route to outcome, and you're not looking at this pathway remains active and vibrant. So the sustainability of effects here will likely be reduced. Do you get that? Okay. Challenges. If you just think of those 3 red lines, interparental, parenting, parenting-child outcome, interparental to child outcome. Challenges. First challenge. Vast majority of research over 30 years, 1980 plus, when we talk about parenting, has focused on the mother-child relationship. We're talking about the interparental context, but very little research on the father-child relationship, or the father-child relationship relative to the mother-child relationship, or the co-parenting relationship in the context of the interparental relationship. That's the first challenge. The second challenge, you need to go back to the slide. About 2000, I presented an academic conference. If you heard me speak before, you'll have heard this story. I wish they wouldn't keep doing that. I spoke at an academic conference, and I presented this model, and this wasn't this model. It was a big longitudinal data set using a UK sample, just advancing those basic hypotheses. Interparental discord affected parenting, affected child outcome. And when we measured children's attributions for conflict, we kept an effect there even when we considered parenting. Okay. Person then put the hand up and said, it's really interesting, Gordon, parent-child problems, interparental conflict, children's conduct problems. Aren't you missing one very important alternative explanation? That actually the vast majority of research in this area, family socialization research, relies on biologically related parents and children. And therefore any associations between the rearing environment provided by parents biologically related to their children can be explained by common genes. That if we're looking at conduct problems and harsh, punitive parenting, they share similar phenotypic attributes, aggression. So mightn't that association just simply be shared genes? Now, as a researcher, that's a substantive challenge to everything I've just said. If there's any young researchers in the room, you always say, possibly, even if you don't have the answer, and then go away and try and come back with the answer. That hypothesis is that shared genes between harsh negative parenting, for example, and conduct problems is explained what's called passive gene-environment correlation, common genes between biological parents and their children. A more contentious hypothesis, particularly from an intervention standpoint, is actually we could take that arrow and turn it around and say child conduct problems evoke more negative parenting. And specifically, genetic attributes in the child may evoke more negative parenting. Guess what? Children do evoke responses. I have 2 of them, and I'm genetically related to them. Typically, they evoke positives, but you do respond. to your child. The hypothesis here is specifically that your parenting style is a product of the child's genetic attributes. Now, you might say, that's just nuts. Well, back in the year 2000, it isn't just nuts, by the way, because I'm being recorded. But before I can go back and say probably not, we need evidence. And at that time, the predominant research design in the field of what's called quantitative behavioral genetics was what's called a twin design, where you had identical twins, non-identical twins. Identical twins are 100% genetically related on average, and non-identicals not 100% genetically related on average. And people looked at gene-environment interplay using those particular types of designs. I'm interested in taking on that challenge. I've got about 20 minutes of substance here, so please bear with me. I'm interested in taking on that challenge. Can you see the practice implications of those hypotheses? That actually family socialization processes may not be pure influences on outcomes for children. If that's the case, in terms of intervention, what are we targeting? So I'm going to try to take on those two questions. I'm not going to spend a long time. In the year 2000, when I was asked that question, I went away and I didn't have an answer. And as I said earlier, I was trained in the don't mention genes if you're not wearing denim school of thought. And thankfully worked at Cardiff, still connected with Cardiff University. A colleague of mine, Professor Anita Thapper, who was a quantitative behaviour geneticist, child and adolescent psychiatrist, world-leading ADHD researcher, and one of the best and most committed clinicians and practitioners I'd ever had the privilege and pleasure to work with. And I went to him with cap in hand one day and said, I need to learn about behavioural genetics. And in 2013, I'll put a paper up in a second, we came back with an answer, 13 years later. It didn't take me 13 years to kind of learn about quantitative behavioural genetics. It took maybe not entirely 13 years, but I'm still learning. But in that time, we had to contend with what are the research options out there for us to take on that question. Aside from all the complexities of different research designs, you need one fundamental attribute of a research design looking at family rearing experiences and child outcome if you were to conclude that those associations exist, whether children are genetically related or not. And that is you want the rearing parents and the child not to be genetically related. And it's standard, obvious research design to look at that question is an adoption design, where children are adopted. In the United Kingdom and other parts of the world, there's usually a lag time to adoption, as you will know, which places another challenge on the interpretation that the rearing environment from adoptive parents to child outcome is pure and unique. It may be influenced actually by the experiences the child has had prior to adoption. At that time, working with complex twin designs and being a student of behavioral genetics, colleagues of mine in the United States, Leslie Lev and a great colleague of mine, Zhao Zhigar, has now passed away, were setting up a research design that they thought they couldn't actually get funded. It took several years to get funded, called the Early Growth and Development Study. And this is an adoption, now the largest adoption study in the world, where children uniquely are adopted at birth. It's a 2.5-day lag time to placement. Children are now age 14. We have information from biological birth mum and a subset of birth dads, adoptive mum, adoptive dad, child, teachers, clinical observation, family observation. It's the most data-intensive study in the world of a group of children and rearing parents and biological relatives, focusing very specifically on the sort of questions we're asking. Okay? Sample attributes are there. Adopted at birth. At the same time, this is a short version, I am being recorded, so I'll give you the short version of this. At the same time, in the vicinity of working with these challenging questions around how do you have a design where rearing parents and children are not genetically related, adoptive design being one, a relative of mine in Ireland was going through in vitro fertilization, inquiring around in vitro fertilization treatment. And while visiting with that relative, just by way of serendipity, being in Dublin, I was sitting in the clinic and the consultant was speaking to my relative, and I was reading a magazine, female relative, and he knocked on the magazine. You have to sort of be from Dublin to get this, or Ireland at least, knocked on the magazine and said, you know, you need to pay more attention to this, this involves you too, and literally waved his finger at me and kind of pointed at me. And I put my hand up and said, no, I said, this is a sibling. I'm not my sister's husband. And he said, oh my God, and turned very Dublin. Before that was a very professional Dublin voice, and then he turned very North Dublin. He said, oh my God, he said, sisters, of course, we can't talk about sperm and eggs and things like that. And I kind of recoiled and sort of, you know, began to turn into my father, intergenerational transmission, and sort of picked the magazine up and said, of course not. My very, very young sister, 8 years younger than me. And we spoke about the case, and he said, I'm very sorry, and he said we refer to the key information here as gametes. And I kind of sat there and very selfishly on the way back talking to my sister, I was getting into the specifics of her individual case. And actually, whether she or her husband would be fully genetically related to a child. And that led to the creation of a new research design, working with, again, my colleague Anita Thapar, Zhao Zhaga, Sir Michael Rutler in London, who framed the final kind of research question. And that actually, in the context of assisted reproductive technology, specifically IVF, you have a subgroup of families where you can have children who were adopted at conception. So uniquely, you have groups of family, parent-child groupings. Homologous IVF, children are fully genetically related to their rearing parents. Sperm donation, not to rearing dad. Egg donation, not to rearing mum. Embryo donation, neither rearing dad or mum. Importantly, surrogacy, related genetically to rearing mum, but the intrauterine environment is provided by someone other than rearing mum. So you have a very, very unique research design where you can figure genetically related mothers and fathers, genetically unrelated mothers and fathers. Do you see that? From conception. So now we have two research designs that really will allow us to get into the question, do rearing experiences map on to child outcomes? Okay? That's the long-winded setup, but you can see why it's important in terms of taking on questions. So I'm going to go through this quite quickly. This is presenting statistical analyses. I won't go into the statistics, so I want to give you the kind of messages. But you can see here, this paper was published, when was it published? 2013. The person who asked me the question back in 2000 was this person, who's now a colleague. And I went back to that conference in 2012 before this was published, and the title of the presentation was Probably Not. Get the question? Can't these associations be explained by common genes? Probably not. But it took 13 years to come back with that. So I don't let go of a proverbial bone in terms of issue. So, again, you will have my slides. These just simply say that the measures we're using, which I'll come back to measures in terms of practice implications at the end of this presentation, the measures we're using are all psychometrically validated, internationally recognized, but we're focusing on interparental conflict, which qualitatively represents frequent, intense, poorly resolved conflicts, not violence, more the silence to mid-level discord. Parenting, harsh, punitive, agitated parenting, again, not violent parenting, and children's conduct problems across the two studies using clinical screening devices, recognized clinical screening devices, the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, and the Child Behavior Checklist, which you will know. What do we see? If I just remind you of the early family stress model, interparental conflict, parenting, and child conduct problems. Yeah? And the hypothesis is, how do we know that these associations would exist? Because the vast majority of past studies have focused on biologically related families. Up here, IVF-H means the IVF study, homologous. Children and rearing parents are genetically related. The blue coefficient is the US adoption sample. Children and rearing parents are not genetically related. If you just look here, these are all statistically significant: interparental conflict, negative parenting, child outcome. These coefficients are statistically exactly the same, 0.32, 0.31. For this group, we can't conclude the association exists because of pure environmental factors, because they're genetically related. For this group, we can conclude this association exists from pure environmental factors because they're not genetically related. The adoptions occurred at conception. Get it? So the association is exactly the same. That's just not saying, well, look, we can all go forward, but actually it's endorsing several decades of previous research. That association exists among children who are not genetically related, where there has been no pre-placement trauma, notwithstanding intrauterine influences, etc. And uniquely, we look at the father-child relationship. And again, here and here. And these associations, again, the same. A methodologist would say, well, that's interesting. You've got mums reporting on conduct problems and mums reporting on parenting and dads reporting here, and dads, they might have self-report bias, seeing things the same way. We just do this statistically. And what you find is those associations remain significant in every instance. So we find associations between maternal and paternal negative parenting and children's conduct problems sourced from interparental conflict, whether you are genetically related or not. You see now why the report that we've written can say whether you're genetically related or not, interparental and parenting behaviours map onto poor outcomes for children. Without this evidence, we cannot say that. This plus sign, what does this mean? With the IVF sample, we can break down genetically related and unrelated mothers and fathers. The plus sign means that the association between interparental conflict, frequent, intense, poorly resolved, and negative paternal, harsh paternal parenting versus maternal parenting, that association is significantly stronger for fathers compared to mothers. So there's a link between conflict and parenting for both mothers and fathers, but the overlap between mood and affect and discord at the interparental level and harsh parenting behaviours is more closely aligned for fathers than for mothers. How many intervention programs target paternal parenting in the context of interparental conflict relative to maternal parenting? Not many. I want to give you one last set of analyses, and I'll give you the kind of policy summative points. So if I go through the next slides, please don't think I'm racing through them. I just want to kind of keep the story ticking. Are we okay for time for 10 more minutes or so? Yeah. Okay, this summarizes what I've just said. We find a support for these processes, the practice context processes that are directly relevant to what you're doing, using really quite unique samples, several thousand individuals in these samples, and I estimated recently those two studies over now 15 years have each cost around about £20 million. A lot of money to come up with that bottom line practice relevant message. I mentioned earlier that children's attributions, their understanding of what's happening around them, are also particularly important when we make the case for interparental discord and conflict. This is a study that the first study I set up when I moved to the United Kingdom. I moved in 1998, and I tried to set up and replicate this early evidence in a UK sample and set up a sample of just over 500 children who were transitioning into secondary school, so year 7 in Wales in the UK. And again, looking at family processes. Just representative of the demographic of England and Wales, a focus on two-parent households. I'm just going to tell you the story, you can look at the details. As children transition to secondary school, back then, early 2000s, mid-2000s, again the question was, well, how do you know that children's behaviour problems don't simply affect parenting and interparental, etc.? So in this study, we looked at one measure that we just had good fortune to have access to, which was Key Stage 3 performance, English, maths, science scores. Educational attainment being a huge predictor of life chances. Okay, so we used the phrase life chances, mental health, and educational attainment. So I'm going to look at these questions, interparental process-based questions, and children's academic attainment, but using a standardized measure of academic performance, not a subjective score, an actual standardized score. In other words, I can't influence that score through self-report in terms of my child's performance. We look at this sample, age 11-year-old UK children, and academic attainment. Parent report of interparental conflict, child report of interparental conflict. We find an association from age 11 to age 13 on English, maths, and science. First study to show a link between interparental conflict that is not violence or not divorce in terms of measure and academic attainment. Interparental conflict in intact, low-risk households, community-based households, and children's academic performance 2 years later on standardized scores. Possible mechanisms. These are proposals now. Possible mechanisms. Discord affects academic attainment through negative parenting. We've seen this, okay? Discord affects academic performance through behavior problems. Most school-based interventions, behavior problems, home-based interventions, parenting. Okay? When we test that, another possible mechanism, let me go back. So the research evidence at this point pretty much focused on the child as object, as I said previously, parenting type roots. Yeah? Following okay? Early research, 1990s, 95, 2000, myself and others saying, well, actually, when you look at children's attributions, their understanding, their emotional arousal, their appraisals, their expectations, we seem to identify more children who present problems than if we don't assess those particular features. So this paper attempted to make that case. Very specifically, when children from as young as 5, we've measured up to age 16, 17, ascribe responsibility. It's my fault. When my parents quarrel, it's usually about things that I do. I can't do things that make myself feel better. My parents quarrel about me. I'm at fault for. And you can apply those types of feelings across an array of household contexts, domestic abuse, etc. clearly mapping on to children's experiences. When we look at that, we have two main possible processes. Interparental conflict affects outcomes via parenting and behavior problems, or via children's perceptions of interparental conflict. This is completely new in terms of proposal, and academic attainment and behavior problems. When we test, i.e. we just look at this question statistically, where you see a bold line, it's a significant association. So interparental conflict affects parenting, affects conduct problems, affects academic attainment. We don't find support for this pathway. Do you see that? So from a policy standpoint, you're back to parenting. We go down here. When we test this, we find this. So when we just look at this question, we find interparental discord affects children's appraisals for that discord. And when those appraisals are about them being at fault, that affects over 1 year their academic attainment. How my child is thinking about my relationship with my wife is affecting his academic attainment 1 year later. Where do you spend the money? Parenting or here? Well, the real test is to put them together. So this was the first paper in this area to do that. Parenting, classic investment area, versus this area. When we put them together statistically, the only way you can get from discord between parents and academic attainment is through there. Do you get that? So now, if you're focusing on parenting or behavior problems in the context of interparental conflict, and you're not focusing on this process, you completely miss out on the mechanism through which attainment is affected. Do you get that? And someone says, well, these children are age 11, 12, 13, they're making a big social transition, they're very stressed, most are going through puberty, their aggression levels are higher, so actually that could explain everything. So when we put that into the equation, you can still communicate through here. So this was one of the most significant papers in terms of a policy impact, because we could show with every test and caveat that discord between adults in intact households, non-separated, low-risk households, affected academic attainment 2 years later via the appraisals children generated off that, even when we supported parenting. Okay, that's the research story. What's the translation story? You can look at this. Interparental conflict maps onto poor outcomes for children in the context of supported parenting, whether adults are living together or not, whether parents, carers are genetically related or not. That evidence is only really, in terms of ink drying, about 2 years old. From a practice standpoint, therefore, the message would be investing in the interparental relationship, supporting the interparental relationship, may not only improve outcomes for children, but might actually improve parenting processes by focusing on the interparental relationship. And indeed, that the children who benefit from those particular programs themselves may take forward behaviors into their own relationships that then improve intergenerational transmission patterns. That's the proposal. 5 minutes. I was asked, and I put this up more as a criticism of myself, not as a story might sound when I tell the story. I was asked about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when was this published? Can you see the year there? See, when you get on in years, you forget just how. A few years ago, I was asked to tell this research story to a practice focus group in the UK. And I presented the story, as I've just presented it, with a little more evidence and detail and various things. And my message was, we really should be supporting the interparental relationship if we're going to improve outcomes for children. And when I finished, in an audience probably about 2 or 3 times the size of this room, the person hosting the event turned to their colleague and said, audibly, doesn't he speak in a funny language? And I genuinely thought for a moment it was my accent. And then everyone burst out laughing across the entire room. It wasn't the most comfortable experience, okay? And I thought about it. And about 6 months later, the academic publication from that group asked me to write a paper called Personal View. So I gave a personal view. And I titled it, Doesn't He Speak in a Funny Language? I had to go back and forth with the journal because they wouldn't accept the title. And I said, well, the story is this. It's not me sort of getting the last word in on someone sort of having a go at me, although they weren't really having a go at me. Is that I want to make a really important point about evidence and practice. Evidence is a fundamental pillar to effective practice. And to quote Leon Feinstein, who I have the highest regard for, former Director of Evidence at EIF and now Children's Commissioner, said, Gordon, you can have the most groundbreaking piece of science, but if you can't communicate it to those who use it, you're really not going to maximize its utility. Hugely important point. So Doesn't He Speak in a Funny Language is actually a paper about the importance of research translation. You've seen all this complex research, etc., etc. It has to be translated into a language that is practice accessible. But let me give you really one important bottom line, proverbial line in the sand. The quality of the research cannot be compromised. The number of times, and again I'm being recorded, I'm happy to say it, where I sit in rooms listening to evidence and asking, where has that evidence come from? But the source of the evidence is deemed to be a robust source of evidence. Again, to quote Sir Michael Rutcher, there's eminence-based evidence, there's evidence-based evidence. And it is most important in terms of practice that you get work from evidence-based evidence. And I hope myself and others in communicating message fall into that category. So yes, we have to communicate our messages, but our messages are sourced from evidence rigor, and that cannot be compromised if you're going to be effective in practice. That's what that paper's about. On the back of that story, I had the good fortune to work with Early Intervention Foundation. Ben is here. Daniel Aqua, Leon Feinstein, Haroon Chowdhury, people I worked with very closely. In pulling together the evidence, to go back to the very start of the presentation, is there evidence to suggest the interparental relationship maps on to improve outcomes for children? And this report tells that story in a much more narrated way and worth reading. It also reviews intervention programs in this area, specifically focusing on the interparental relationship. We had up to about 100 programs submitted as potentially eligible for this review. It got down to 15. Really 13. 15 in terms of eligibility, with one popping up as scoring in the vicinity of efficacy. That's not saying the programs are not themselves efficacious. One, it means the programs deemed to be eligible where does the child focus are relatively few in the UK. And where they have been implemented, their implementation and their evaluation requires some reflection. And that's where we are presently. The Department for Work and Pensions put out their Helping Workless Families policy document in 2017, April 2017. If you want to go into that document, and if you find your way through the appendices, you'll find this particular link. And this link is really the substance of the challenge I was given, was to link economic disadvantage, other indices of risk for children as they map onto the interparental and parent-child relationships and child outcomes. And this resource is interactive, and you can say I have a 5-year-old child, he has experienced divorce, there's economic disadvantage, you can click your way through that, and it will give you a profile of typical developing features in that child and atypical developing features in that child. It took about 6 months to put together, and my research team, Ruth Sellers, Amelia Smith, and others, I commend on this. This will take you through everything you need to know about typical development versus atypical development, specific to the context of economic disadvantage worklessness. This publication on the right-hand side was then commissioned, Children and Young People Now, to tell the story of the Helping Workless Families launch. What is that story? The story is this. You now have initially £30 million and some other monies more recently committed to that particular policy initiative, specifically targeting interparental relationship support for youth outcomes in the context of economic disadvantage worklessness. Okay, that's where we now are, and that's eligible monies for you to apply for and pursue. I was asked to give a recommendation about, well, what programs should we implement? What are our next steps? As I said, there are very few, if any, robustly evidenced programs in this area trialed in the United Kingdom. That doesn't mean there aren't programs that potentially are robust and efficacious to purpose, and a next step in this process will be that, bringing in programs that can be trialed by you on the ground and evidenced so that you can implement your practice interests relative to this evidence base. So, it's not going to be a big black hole in terms of programs. So that's following. If you read that article, there's 3 core recommendations that I make in terms of where to start. Where do you start? With you. First and foremost, giving you the resources you need to assess and implement inquiry in this area. What does that mean? Right from the start. How do you introduce to an adult or adults in front of you questions around the interparental relationship without saying, I'm invading your privacy? That's the first step. Resources and training to do that. And actually, when it comes to asking about child outcomes, this is the split between the couple relationship and the interparental relationship. You're not asking questions about the intimate aspect of the couple relationship. You're asking questions about the inter-adult relationship that map onto outcomes for the child, including parenting. It's a shift in framing those questions, but those questions are directly relevant to the outcomes you're trying to access. So the first step is skills, resources, capacity training to do that. Second, the actual assessment materials, questionnaires and the like that tap into this area and that focus in on features of that relationship, from a single parent who's in a relationship relevant to the child, two parent and other couple types, right the way through to every other family configuration. That's a relationship focus, interparental, inter-adult focus, parenting and child outcome. What questionnaires do you use? We recommend that in the DWP document and forthcoming in another paper. Third, training. If you implement a questionnaire and you derive a score, what does that mean? Not every case will require support. And not every case that you think shouldn't be assessed might need to be assessed. So it's introducing a skill base and doing that in a way that complements what you're already doing. The point Sally made earlier. This is not saying to social workers or other practitioners, you need to do more. Quite the opposite. This is consolidating what you're already doing, giving you resources to do that and to join big pieces up. Interparental relationship functioning, parenting, child mental health, child protection, the latter of which you're already fully versed in pursuing. But training to weld those wider family, interparental, contextual factors relative to parenting, scoring, and then based on the score and the measure, what programs fit, not just a program, but what programs work for that particular individual, representative of that group, where there's a focus on interparental relationship dynamics and child outcome. So that paper and forthcoming papers from DWP and next steps are in that space. It's equipping you as a workforce with resources, confidence to implement and engage in this field so that the programs you implement have a chance of working for where it really matters, the adults and the children. This is the very last slide. That complicated plate of spaghetti over on the far right, and took them on my left, you're right, is also in that DWP report. And what is its bottom line? Well, guess what? It's all very interesting research, Gordon, and we can see the case. Where do we save money? So this is a cascade model that shows if you focus on interparental relationship support early with the populations and groups you're focusing on, and where those supports, this is key, where those programs actually affect interparental discord, you improve very costly areas of adult support. Domestic abuse, depression, substance misuse. Where that relationship is improved, you affect parenting. You affect children's early emotional, cognitive, social skills. Those domains of improvement complement each other. They then transfer out to emotional, behavioral, academic, and further outcome areas, which then come down to your really costly areas: education, mental health, unemployment, poor physical health, NHS. So your costs are cascading, your savings are cascading. And this is the framework DWP are currently operating to in terms of their cost models. I'll just leave you with this. The real starting place is youth who are presently at risk. Working with the risk contexts, working with the reason. The young man, the young boy, Keith, in the slide licking the ice cream, is upset. Do we target just the upset, or do we target the early causes of the upset? In terms of this area, youth at risk, context of economic disadvantage, by focusing on interparental relationship across different family types, impacts on parenting, impacts on youth outcome, improving youth outcomes, you will see an intergenerational transmission by way of improvement. After 30 plus years of investment, that's where we have to start. Thank you.
generate any question you may have on anything that you've heard this morning for Gordon and Sally, and then we'll come back and take a sample of those questions. Thank you.
I'm here to trace off the close.
Twisted sideways on it as well.
We'll make sure that you can get all the references. So, yeah, this is just a chance to give any major reflections and if there's any particular questions from our table, decide who's going to ask them. And it can't be me, because I'm going to go and try and answer some of them. Yeah, just any sort of reflections or key questions that came from it. It's a lot there, I mean, it's obviously it's complicated stuff, detailed stuff, but some key messages as well.
Okay, the facilitator's got some questions. Can we... What 5 minutes before, sorry, I did say that mistakenly, I thought Gordon had to leave us, but he is around until about 3 o'clock, so we'll just pick up any concise and particularly clarifying questions now based on what we've heard this morning. There'll be more opportunities to pick some of it up in the discussions over lunch and this afternoon. But if perhaps the table at the back, is there a question from the back corner? There.
It's a very good question. If you're attending to the interparental relationship and its dynamics, you are informing how the child experiences that. So the intervention isn't necessarily at the child's level of appraisal, but those appraisals are affected by that relationship. So if I give an example in a domestic violence context, where interventions target the child's understanding of the whys behind pretty extreme experiences, that's a very important mechanism through to recovery. But actually, the source of the impact is ultimately the events around the child. So targeting that relationship and its silence to violence dimensions is the key intervention site.
Table here.
Yeah, we had a question. It seems ever increasingly apparent that grandparents are taking a primary role, and just wondering how you would comment on how that complicates or interferes with or
Helps.
how that helps the management processes that have direct influence there.
Also a very, very important question. So again, to go back to the earlier question, so what we know about children who experience early trauma, they are more sensitive and sensitized to later experiences. So in the various reports we've written, we say interparental, inter-adult carer relationships, very specifically. So to use two examples, where a child is taken out of an adverse early context, placed with family relatives, and that's a positive, nurtured, enriched environment, they can do better. There's no less importance, if you like, placed on the dynamic between those adults, if dynamic between adults has been a distinctly significant feature for that child. So there's continuity of experience, and then what we call sensitization is one very interesting piece of research. You're driving a car, you get used to how you drive the car, called habituation. Children who experience conflict become what's called sensitized. They respond more severely to lower levels of conflict if they experience extreme conflict early. So enriched environments help. Negative environments continue the problem. Whether you're genetically related or not. Yeah.
Table 4. Okay. Table 8. Any new points? Any new questions? Will you speak up?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to have a conversation over lunch on this. I mean, the evidence is that where you can engage adults in a relationship in the context of economic disadvantage, children do distinctly better. Why? Well, I'm going to give my own personal view rather than go off on a bit of a tangent here. Where you offer support in contexts where little support has been effective, that particular support target can be particularly effective. Relationships remain important for people. Parents fundamentally remain invested in their children, on average. Where you're providing support to those who experience day in, day out stress, and where that support maps onto day-to-day experience that supports them and normalizes their experiences, you see improvements. So interparental relationship support in the context of economic disadvantage shows improvements for children, shows improvements in parenting, and shows improvements in adult mental health, where you are not targeting those areas. So the answer is yes, you can make a significant difference.
Any table that hasn't spoken yet, any concise questions for clarification?
Similar to what Olivia was saying there, is there any regional variation in child perceptions of interparental conflict?
Yeah. Interesting question. Regional variation, again, a paper just about to come out. We show continuity of associations, interparental risk co-parenting across ethnicity, age, geography, culture. It's more the severity, intensity of the dynamic between adults as compared to any regional variations. So discordant relationships in high-income households in nice leafy London, and discordant relationships in low-income households in other parts of the UK. It's the discordant relationship that communicates effects to children.
Any final? You want to speak up? Sorry.
I was just interested if there is a lot of emphasis on engaging fathers.
Yeah, so the question was evidence around engaging fathers. So I would point you again to the EIF DWP report. There's a whole section in there on specifically that. And there's fairly new evidence around engaging fathers, work showing that where you engage fathers, you actually see more effective maternal-child parenting impacts, for obvious reasons. There's more joined up. So there's lots of evidence coming out in this area. Engaging fathers appears to be, not surprisingly, a distinctly important feature if you want effective interparental parenting and co-parenting impacts on children. Yeah. And particularly hard to reach fathers. There's some work in this area in the report.
Any final question on ground that hasn't been covered? If not, can we thank Gordon and Sally for speaking today? Flagship restaurant is ready. Straight across the corridor here.
So I'll be back.
People come together.
I'll be back, okay? Thanks very much.
Thank you for that.